I'm happy to introduce Zoe Butt. Zoe is a curator and writer based in Vietnam. Her curatorial practice centers on building critically thinking and historically conscious artistic communities, fostering dialogue among countries of the Global South. She also, though in her work, has reconsidered and renegotiated the term Global South, just to mention that as well. And currently, she is artistic director of Factory Contemporary Arts Center in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam's first purpose-built space for contemporary art. Zoe formerly served as executive director and curator at Sun Art from 2009 to 2016, and was director of international programs at Long March Project Beijing for 2 years, 2007 to 2009, and assistant curator contemporary art at Queensland Art Gallery in Brisbane. She has written and published extensively and has commissioned major works by artists, and she will also perhaps discuss some of those with us as part of her role as co-curator of the last Sharjah biennial. Welcome.
Thank you for the invitation, Team Experimenter, and to all of you for enduring 3 days. I would like to start with two statements that I look at every morning, and it's been sitting on my dresser for the last nearly 3 years. It matters what thoughts think thoughts. It matters what knowledges know knowledges. It matters what relations relate relations. It matters what worlds world worlds. It matters what stories tell stories. By Donna Haraway. Another one, home is not where you were born. Home is where all your attempts to escape cease. By Naquib Mahfouz. Both of these statements mean a lot to me. Indeed, they have shaped very much my own approach to curating, to building community, to sustaining memory, and making art. The first matters to me because I chose to leave the museum world from a very deliberate inquiry that I continue to ask myself. To what end can a curator claim the right to speak when we have not seen or experienced the contexts in which an artist works? That question prompted me to leave and go and work with and for artists, firstly in China and then in Vietnam. The second quote is a constant reminder that I am a guest in the place in which I have chosen to call my home. But it is also a reminder of my own past, where I am a Hong Kong British ancestral person who was born in Australia, but have not lived in that country for nearly 15 years and have chosen to travel the world and anchor myself from communist contexts between China and Vietnam. To what extent does my memory and my voice have validity? So these two counterpoints continue to tussle with me on a daily basis with the work that I do, which fundamentally, in many ways, I find myself a little bit of an alien in this group, because visibility for me is problematic. Oh, can someone go to the next slide? I've dropped and broken it. Thank you. So in my own work, this is my visibility. I have chosen to fundamentally attach myself to contexts where I cannot do exhibitions. So what does that mean for me as a curator with my labor? Now, when I say I cannot do exhibitions, of course we create them, but they are never what the artist and I envisage. So in a museum context, to which that is indeed where I was trained and where it's come from, We are, as curators, trained to facilitate the vision of the artist. But what do you do when you're in a context where you're dealing with not only cultural determinations of what you can and cannot say, but political ramifications? So again, the spaces to which that are fundamentally the most important to me is the space of dialogue. So when it comes to thinking about my decisions to curate, to think of my mind every morning and what matters, first of all, it's the privileging of visibility. To what extent can I, with my own voice, speak to major houses of art today and question their curatorial minds into encapsulating the labor of an artist beyond visibility? Because indeed, many of the artists that I included in my Sharjah biennial are key educators. They are key community builders. Their labor is much more than just creating art objects for the exhibitionary circuit. So to what extent do we as institutional curators give some kind of acknowledgement to that in the writing, in the speaking, in the creating of exhibitions that we do? Secondly, I think about navigating political poverty. How do we, as curators in the commissioning, in the invitations extended to artists, to what extent do we care for the implications of that in their local? For example, I'm quite stunned at the number of awards that are attached to exhibitions in my region of Southeast Asia, labeled human rights and freedom of expression. And yet they do not understand that if that artist is awarded that prize, they enter a country with the label of freedom and they are thus surveilled. So to what extent do these initiating bodies, which are often forms of government and diplomacy, to what extent do they care about the wording and the impact that has on an artist? I also think about spaces of trust, because when you're dealing with political poverty, when you're dealing with zones of visibility that are highly regulated, to be able to freely share with the curator is highly contentious. The number of times I have sat in front of young artists who really don't share anything. And it's only upon insisting to visit the studio, to sit and have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, or indeed most of the time it's alcohol. That is only when you can see little snippets of things in the studio and you sit and you ask, what is that in the corner? Oh, don't worry, don't look at that, that's nothing, that's just a small sketch, doesn't mean anything. I said, no, actually, can you pull it out? I'd like to see it. And then they're begrudgingly putting it out, and then it's often the gem. And then with a little bit of cajoling, they start to tell you how that is what they are working on at night. And you say, well, why didn't you share this with me in the first instance? Oh, I didn't know if I could trust you. So this has also become an acknowledgement of the role of dialogue and building community so that artists understand that we are all in the business of engaging these censored worlds. And we need to acknowledge that this space needs to be critically engaged by sharing openly. The final thing I think about is regulating fear. I'm the director of an institution, and it's the only purpose-built institution in Vietnam. How do I, as someone who is being told by government, you can't do your projects, which means I'm the facilitator to the artist saying, I'm terribly sorry, you can't speak in this way, you can't visualize in this way. So my role becomes a part of a government regulation of fear. So how do I navigate that as a curator? So these are the sort of 4 registers that are constantly with me every day. Natasha briefly mentioned my commitment to what I call the globalizing Souths. Now, you know, the term global South is a kind of common thread of phrase. And I have problems with that because it's attached to a geopolitical idea of liberalism that I feel is a very top-down approach. My own attachment to the idiom globalizing Souths is thinking of my own, again, everything somewhat always becomes personal. My family themselves came from China and England, but ended up in Australia. And my Chinese side of the family is spread out all across South and Southeast Asia and China. So this kind of trajectory is always in movement. indeed most of my family has had several centers of which they've been based in their life. And I'm struck by how many artists are similar. They have moved away from where they were born, but they still care very much about those narratives from whether or not they're based in Norway or Dhaka. So the idea of a globalizing South is more to me about the memory of a South in a globalizing context and what are the dangers around globalizing mechanism, because we are, as cultural workers, always unable to escape that center mechanism, which is capital. So how are we engaging, delinking and relinking from that with our movements? On a more localized note, my commitment to thinking about globalizing Souths comes from working particularly in Vietnam, more and across Southeast Asia, where I recognize that institutions such as Alliance Française, the Goethe Institute, the British Council, the Japan Foundation have done incredible work, and I'm not denying their role in pushing the languages of contemporary art in my region. However, it's very problematic when a Vietnamese artist goes to Germany and is inserting themselves in highly serviced infrastructures. There's collectors and writers and curators and funders, and there's historians who are interested in their work. There's galleries, there's museums, there's private foundations. And then they come home and there is nothing. So can you imagine what happens when you return after some year-long residency and you think to yourself, why the F am I home? And then there's this question of home. And I have seen too many artists give up their practice because they feel, I'm not going to make any money, first of all. I'm not going to gain any validity because who's listening to me from here? And they quit. So then I also started to realize that we need, as curators, to better link projects of synergy that are historically mapping memory so that their validity isn't reliant on funding from abroad, that in a sense, let's be frank, is just colonial residual capital. So moving on to the Sharjah biennial. And so this brief, I'm going to have to really be careful not to go over time. What I hope to be able to have time to present is one thread of the Sharjah biennial, and to then also take a risk in presenting to you an upcoming project that I'm currently developing with the factory in Ho Chi Minh City. So Natasha was very supportive of me putting together something to discuss that's not actually fleshed out yet. So anyway. The Sharjah Biennial. For those of you who may not know, it was called Leaving the Echo Chamber. There were 3 curators, myself, Omar Khalif, and Claire Tancons. The Sharjah Biennial Foundation left it open to us as to how to put together a joint platform where there are 3 minds coming from 3 very vast different geographies who had never met before. So we actually decided, due to time restraints and time zone differences, we decided it would be better to each curate our own response to a theme we mutually came up with together, which was leaving the echo chamber. My own response is called Journey Beyond the Arrow. And the idea of this echo chamber was luckily in synergy with the 3 of us who believe that we're operating in a globe today where the chamber we live in, both physically and virtually, can sometimes be monitored and dictated by only a select number of echoes, to the point that we are, in a sense, reverberating within a very small space. And so this exhibition for each of us was an opportunity to insert more walls in the room, if you like, but from very different kinds of perspectives. So for me, it was about thinking of, wrong way. It was about histories. It was about understanding that artists work with certain tools. For me, context has meant everything to my practice, and I think that those tools that artists are fundamentally fascinated by start as a context of response to place. So for me, I was looking at how artists So I use this analogy of the bow and arrow, the idea that the artist's practice is the bow and it's situated. But the arrow, which is the artwork, is always looking at arriving at a certain space and time. So what does it take for that context to shoot the arrow? What is the energy that it takes? What is the research? What is the mapping required to get it to that final destination? So for me, I was doing a lot of personal searching again. I took the opportunity of the biennial to revisit a lot of artists' conversations that I had had in my brief history. I knew of a number of certain relationships between works that were in gestation but had never had the funding to be realized. And it's largely these conversations. There's a couple of conversations that I will focus on today. But this is just a brief summary. There were 13 new commissions, fundamentally attached to thinking about human movement and exchange, and the 6 sort of subject breakdowns that my own response centered around were the Indian Ocean and its colonial Arab exchange, the impact of the Japanese occupation on Southeast Asia, histories as becoming gendered, unofficial histories contesting the idea of nation, the instrumentalization of cultural nostalgia, and time and its shape in nurturing human empathy. So to begin, I want to share my own. I visited Senegal in 2015, and that was a very personal trip for me. And I was quite struck by the fact that in Dakar, there were a strong Vietnamese community. Since 2015, I've long wanted to work with Tuan Andrew Nguyen, a Vietnamese artist whose own refugee history somewhat encapsulates a similar story that he'd never had the chance to unpack. His family didn't actually make it to Senegal, but they were moving through Southeast Asia and eventually ended up in certain ports in West Africa. I wanted to show you a really brief clip because I think it's necessary to sort of anchor this 4-channel installation somewhat, which sat in an outdoor courtyard in Sharjah, surrounded by a huge amount of sand on the floor. Now, the sand is a reference to Dakar, which, if any of you have been, is absolutely constantly covered in sand. So no matter how much you want to remove the sand from the house, from the street, it's impossible. But I also want to bring in Tuan's voice a little bit, because that was another mechanism for my show, in that I felt it necessary to have the artist's voice present as much as possible. So most of the texts that were generated for the show, I commissioned the artists to write the text, and it wasn't an easy task to get them to do this. Many of them struggled, and some were co-written between us, but I find that what resulted was a very beautiful textual, critical response to not only their visual work. So just a brief from Tuan. It's called The Spectre of Ancestors Becoming. French colonial subjects, called Chilia Senegalese or Chilia Indo-Chinois, defended France in world wars far from home until the mid-20th century. When the Vietnamese rose up against French colonial rule, French colonial forces from the West Africa were shipped to help quell the uprising. There are stories of Chilia Senegalese defecting from their positions on the battlefield to join the Vietnamese revolutionary soldiers. These stories of solidarity exist as hearsay, as unrecorded and invalid myths. Throughout the war and after the defeat of the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the moment philosopher Frantz Fanon declared to be the beginning of the end of the French Empire, hundreds of Vietnamese women and their children migrated to Senegal with their Senegalese husbands, colonial soldiers of the French army, who had been stationed to Indochina. Many other soldiers left their wives and took only the children. Still others took children not their own, some of whom were métis and others who were completely Vietnamese, the latter raised as Senegalese and often without the knowledge of their origins. Within this largely unwritten history, personal stories and incomplete secrets come to undermine the monolithic quality of established historical narratives. In this work, the Senegalese Vietnamese community reveals the resonating effects of colonialism, migration, memory, and identity through the bridges and gaps formed from generation to generation.
Intérieur, appartement, Saigon, nuit. Lan, femme vietnamienne, approchant la trentaine, lave la vaisselle dans un évier. Un homme grand et noir, Wally, entre. On vient de m'informer, on est sur le prochain bateau. Le pasteur part dans 3 jours. Il faut vraiment qu'on prévoie des manteaux pour les enfants. Ils n'ont pas besoin de manteaux. Marseille est froide à cette époque de l'année. On pourrait y être pour un moment avant qu'ils nous transfèrent chez nous. Ils vont geler sans manteau. Les enfants ne gèleront pas à Saigon, c'est ici, chez nous. On ne va pas recommencer. Il n'y a plus de temps pour ça. Quand on s'est mariés, tu ne m'avais pas dit qu'on aurait à partir d'ici. Quand on s'est mariés, on était en pleine guerre. Maintenant, il n'y a plus de guerre. Ce n'est pas moi qui décide de partir ou non. Je suis soumis au cours de l'histoire. Nous avons perdu. Nous? Tu sais ce que je veux dire. Si on reste, je peux tout aussi bien me suicider. 5 de nos soldats ont déjà été tués. Je ne peux pas sortir dans la rue sans entendre un haut-parleur ou voir des banderoles pour me rappeler que je ne suis pas le bienvenu ici. Et j'ai des ordres. Rester ici fera de moi un traître. Alors c'est moi que tu préfères trahir. Toi et moi appartenant au même camp, Lan, celui des assujettis. Et nous ne contrôlons rien de ce qui nous arrive. Mais nous pouvons faire le choix d'être ensemble. Et tu dois me suivre. Même si la guerre est finie, le Français maintient son emprise sur la Vietnamienne sans défense. Le Français? Ne me fais pas rire. Je ne suis Français que quand ils ont besoin de corps pour arrêter les balles. Et noir le reste du temps. Ne m'appelle plus Taïden, s'il te plaît. Taïden, c'est juste un occidental à la peau noire. Je ne suis pas un occidental. Ce n'est pas un terme péjoratif. Pour moi, si. Pas comme les mots que vous utilisez, vous, et les Français blancs, pour parler des filles ici. C'est toi qui veux aller à Marseille. C'est pas l'Occident, ça, peut-être. Notre destination finale, c'est Dakar. Ma famille est là-bas.
So I wanted to show a brief excerpt because I wanted to give part of the dilemma with curating, for me, the Sharjah biennial. There was an immense amount of history and archival material collected over most of the 13 commissions that were produced for the biennial. Tuan and I had many different conversations about how to utilize some of this very, very rare photography found in the archives in Paris. And it was quite marked to visit Dakar and then find families who had their own personal archives to complement these pictures of soldiers. And so to what extent can a film give enough historical fact, or are we continuing to just exoticize in the creation of these commissions? I struggled with knowing how, and I still do contemplate this a lot post-biennial, how can the catalogue, how can more text be generated to give back the memories to these images? Tuan's piece that you just saw were 4 fictional conversations created with the descendants of 4 particular Vietnamese Senegalese families. And these fictional stories, quite, again, markedly, had already been written. So Tuan actually was the one that stepped in and gave them visual opportunity. Another work I wanted to share, because this work of Tuan was very much, this is a beautiful photograph of a family of Jean-Claude Do in Senegal. I very much saw Tuan's commission in conversation with the work of Jompet Kuswadanandanto from Indonesia. Again, a commission resulting from a personal journey I did also 2015 to Ghana, where I came across the Java Museum in Elmina, which is at the end of Elmina Fort, the fort that processed the highest number of slaves across the Atlantic. And you cross to the other end of the street in this village, and there's this tiny little Java Museum with a collection of wayang puppetry and batik, because 2 Ghanaian prints had been purchased by the Dutch, taken as trophies to the Netherlands in the expositions, and then shipped to Jakarta, where they subsequently married Jakarta ladies. However, the Indonesian material was sent back home. So I, again, since 2015, was in conversation with Jompet, who's been researching the impact of Dutch colonial histories on Indonesia for a very long time. And he and I also were talking about, wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to do something in response to this trajectory? So when the biennial came up, Tuan and Jompet were still already in my head. So I wanted to also play a soundtrack to this particular image, because it's quite important to, and if we can just have it playing in the background while I'm talking. So Jompet's piece, Keroncong Concordia, is a response to a piece of music called Keroncong, which was a style developed by Indo-Europeans and rooted in the Portuguese fado. Now, Portuguese fado is initially played in Indonesia by 17th century slaves. Keroncong Concordia responds to a certain building called Society Concordia in Bandung. It is the building that the famous Bandung Conference was eventually held. But in its first creation, it was a social club designed by the Dutch. And it was in this particular building that permission to enter particular areas was restricted according to race and to class. And it divided Dutch, Indo-Dutch, Indo-African, Chinese, native Indonesian, and other mixed blood communities. What is quite ironic about this is that this method of discriminating was part of the legacy of Keroncong, in that this form of music known to be pushed or played by slaves, eventually the elite Dutch classes recognized it as one of the key forms of music that the Dutch had given to Indonesia. So it's partly this irony that Jompet speaks to in this installation, where a massive glass bird has fallen to the ground and smashed. And it's this vision of a united sense of Indonesia that's being divided into all of these different class systems. It is rumored that this club gave way to understanding how apartheid might work in South Africa. For this particular piece, Jompet interviewed a number of Indo-African soldiers, they called KNIL, or otherwise Belanda Hitam, the Black Dutchman, which you'll find Black Dutchmen all across the old Dutch Empire. And he took himself to the Netherlands, he interviewed old veterans, and he was quite struck by certain stories of a man who, after his post as one of these soldiers under the Dutch, he was then taken and imprisoned by the encroaching Japanese forces. And he became a prisoner of war under Japanese occupation. And the story of this, behind this glass piece, are several in video screens that you hear him talking and you hear this music moving and weaving in and out. This piece was in conversation with Tuan's work, again, for me, in that there was a vast amount of research and archival material collected that Tuan actually decided to interweave into the imagery that you saw, whereas Jompet decided to actually abstract it completely and focus alone on the music itself. And in many ways, the music of Jompet and Kerenchong became another element for my biennial. For those of you who didn't get to see it, my March meet was very much driven by the movement of theatre and song and how it can become a discursive platform. Can we turn it up just a little bit so people can get a sense of it? Just a little bit. Just fully loud. Wow, time goes so quickly. I've got 5 minutes. Okay, so I'm not going to be able to... I've got so much material to talk about the instrumentalization of violence. I may not be able to talk about my other project. Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to speak a little bit about other threads of the show that curatorially were quite problematic for me to contemplate how to visualize. So Miro Kazumi decided to go and the idea of violence has been quite a common preoccupied sort of state for me psychologically, because I'm living in highly censored environments myself. But then I'm also, and indeed I am on a blacklist, but I also am aware that artists are dealing with histories that are quite problematic also. Kazumi decided to go and interview a war vet from Japan who had been trained by Japanese soldiers to kill, decapitate, rape and murder. And this one man in the central part of the screen recounts the feelings of what it was like to go through such an act. And then with a group of young people, he asks them to memorize these confessions. And as a consequence of memorizing these confessions, he's questioning our inheritance of shame, and to what extent shame and its instrumentalization of violence is something that we are aware of when it comes to building narratives of nation. I was drawn to the fact that the Sharjah Biennial, the foundation permitted this piece because it was very visceral in its textual sharing of violence. That you hear rape being explained and what the feelings were like. It was quite markedly, I was very happy that we were able to get it up. But it was important to me as a strategy that the actual texts were provided, not only that you could hear it, but that you could read it. And for me, it was that process of putting it in text that was also very important to include in the show. Kadim Ali was also interesting for me for thinking about how forms of education today in Afghanistan continue to follow. It was interesting hearing Paz talk about how CIA is supporting the arts. This is a book that teaches how to count across Afghanistan. So you can see 1 equals 1 Kalashnikov, 2 equals 2 knives, 3 guns, 4 umbrellas, and so on. This is a publication spread out across the country for learning how to count. It's paid for by an institution in Nebraska. This work on the far right is talking about the role of charity and thinking about how the Taliban are the most revered in Afghanistan because they are the most immediate responders. It's much more complex a work than that, but I sadly don't have time. I really want to sort of speed. I could talk about Fantawan for hours, but I just want to touch upon the work of Ahmad Fuad Osman and Kidlat Tahimik. Ahmad Fuad Osman is a Malaysian artist who has dedicated much of his past 5 years in thinking about Enrique de Malacca. He was a slave to Ferdinand Magellan and is said to have, Ferdinand Magellan is written into history as the first to circumnavigate the globe. But in fact, he died in Mactan in 1521, and it was his slave, Enrique de Malacca, that did the entire journey. But the Western art history canons don't actually talk about it in this way, and so Fuad has gone and created his own archive to document and visualize what this kind of history means to the Malayan archipelago. Indeed, many local historians, shamans, and historians have written and spoken and teach the relevancy of Enrique. And the way that Fuad chose to insert this into this half-fictional, half-real archive is to create these iPads that were spread out throughout the display, showing the over 85 interviews that he has done with all of these various forms of intelligence as a way to substantiate his archive, which opened up another thread of thinking for my platform, which is histories as fiction. In much of my own region, textbooks mean nothing because they are indeed official accounts of history that are written by those who conquered. Indeed, that is history, but it's more markedly deleted in my part of the world. Conversations continuing the thread of how artists converse with one another across the biennial. I saw Fuad's work very much in keeping with Kidlat Tahimik, a very prominent Filipino third cinema maker, essay maker, and he did this work called Memories of Overdevelopment, where he's looking at the journey of Enrique de Malacca and picturing the tale from the perspective of Enrique. So not only was there an archive by a Malayan artist giving actual objective evidence to the existence of this man, but then the role of film in historicizing history. It was also important to me to think about Kidlat's own work as, for me, as an artist. This was the first exhibition internationally that he was to be showcased as a visual artist. The world has mostly understood him only as a cinema maker. But the more time I visited him many times in Baguio in the north. He's an Ifugao spokesman. He's been accepted into that community, which is an indigenous community in the north. And he lives with his props. All of the props from his films are beings. They are what he calls part of his kapwa, his interdependent relationship to nature, to the world. And so we brought all of his props together in one major installation, which is a stormy, it's quite lengthy, a stormy clash between two goddesses of the winds, the protracted culture war. So it's really frustrating having so little time. So just to share that this is one thread of the biennial, showcasing how artists for me have set up memories for me. Indeed, I was thankful to the foundation for allowing me to do this because I wasn't a curator going shopping for my artists for my biennial. It was very much a personal opportunity for me to revisit some conversations that had been long gestating with me for more than a decade. That wasn't to be said that I didn't also do some research for new talent. I had certain people in mind that I wanted to know more about, but it was a great opportunity to put these things together. I don't think I have time to talk about the factory, but just to sort of end there, and maybe we can have some touch on this for Q&A. This is the factory where I'm currently artistic director. We are the first purpose-built space for contemporary art in Vietnam, and we opened in 2016 and committed to broadening the awareness of art and contemporary art and artists in society. Due to the heavily regulated environments that we live in, much of the programming is double-edged in that we have a visible program which we publicly promote and get licensed to do. But then, as my first slide indicates, 50% of what I'm doing is offline and developing work with artists. So when it comes to thinking about curating for me, I'm very much more thinking about what I respond to Naomi's comment also about modes of production and understanding that modes of production is also a way of learning and talking about art, and it's not just about the final display. Thank you.
Actually, just take it from there to continue because it would be quite useful to just understand how also your involvement with Sun Art then has sort of grown into your agenda for the factory, which is of course a completely different space, and as it's a sort of purpose built, and there's a patron in terms of different stream of funding. But if you could just bridge your journey between these two from the same sort of geography, yeah, that would help.
So I went from running projects, as you would have heard with Tarun, over $2 million projects, to then going to San Art, which is an artist-driven collective in Saigon. And I went from $2 million to $10,000 a year, and no salary. So basically it was, a real flip. But in between that was China. Sorry, I was also in Beijing for 3 years prior to that. Anyway, Vietnam. So San Art was a small little collective where Vietnamese overseas artists who were refugees returning, and their relationship to the local was very contentious. To be overseas Vietnamese was to be a traitor. So the local community was highly suspicious of anyone of that ilk wanting to engage. So they asked me to come on board as their director to generate programs with them that would bridge that gap, so that these overseas Vietnamese would be slowly understood that they were there to actually be a part of their community and their memory, and we are one unity trying to move forward. We realized many different kinds of projects, from artist residency programs to very strong group critiques that became labs for thinking about practice and the meaning of practice, both in Vietnam but also overseas. There was also a number of platforms such as Conscious Realities, where we brought a number of speakers from across the global south to come in and undertake workshops and residencies in unpacking memories of relevance to not only Vietnam, but unpacking regionalisms, thinking about theory from a point of view of Vietnam. So we did have this crazy workshop translating Edouard Glissant into French and then English and then into Vietnamese. So translation was a very common part of my life since I moved to Vietnam. But then in 2015-16, San Art underwent a really very hard time with the government. They were not appreciating the fact that we were trying to bring international talent in. They were not appreciating the fact that a lot of the Vietnamese artists were becoming more independent and vocal and creative with practices. And when I finally realized that we would get a marked policeman turning up to the reading room of a morning and saying, I noticed that you didn't take your daughter to school this morning. What's going on? And then you realize the level of watch that's going on. And then also when they're officially requesting the list of foreigners attending your events. So then at that point I realized this is actually getting impossible. I also cannot raise money because funders want visibility. If I can't promote the event, they won't support. So it was really quite problematic. Luckily at that time, the founder of the factory revisited me. That's a longer story of how I got to meet her, but she returned into my life at a time that I couldn't have blessed her more, because she was able to get me my papers. I'd been an illegal citizen of Vietnam for 8 years. And she said, would you run the factory for me? And it was, I said to her, I don't know that that's a very good idea, because I bring quite a reputation with me. I have a blacklist reputation. She says, don't worry, I'll deal with it. And it's been quite a really amazing journey just these last 3.5, nearly 4 years, to have her support. Not only financially, but conceptually, strategically. And she's the only one today in the region actually understanding the role of curatorial training and hiring young curators and encouraging me to train and to create international partnerships. Our relationship to the Ministry of Culture, Sport and Tourism is incredibly tenuous. I have a full-time lawyer on staff. Absolutely every single thing we do has to be licensed, which means every single text, every single motivation, mapping, design of the space, all has to be shared in advance. So there's somewhat of a thank you museums for training me about the forward planning of how to put things in place. So every day is a constant navigation. One of the problems with this particular program that we're hoping to get up, indeed funding is now dropping, as in it's arriving, which is great. But this project is looking at how Vietnamese traditions rely on an understanding of the elements, fire, water, wind, earth. And they consume these conceptually to the point that there are some certain Buddhist temples that are using a vast amount of virgin forest and causing extreme degradation. Or there's a sense that we want rhino horn and we're going to then cause a rhino to become extinct because we spiritually rely on it so much. Now these are issues that we want to unpack in this fellowship. But again, I'm concerned that the government will not appreciate a targeting focus on rituals that may have repercussions that they could be seen as out of control with.
Just so continuing from there, because conscious reality is just something that you wanted to also expand on a bit more. If you could go into with examples, just quickly, how you also thought about regionalism through sort of including Latin American and African participation, looking at elements of mythology, which seems to be also continuing in this new part of the project in terms of ritual and thinking of healing, etc. But really bringing also social scientists on board. So the fact that you've been another curator who's very committed to interdisciplinary thinking as a way to also negotiate between research and exhibition practice.
So Conscious Realities was 2013 to 2016. And it was, you can see a slide here where we had Ntone Ajabe from Cape Town coming to, this is a shot of him trying to talk about Edouard Glissant and opacity and transparency. But this program really was in response to an understanding in my local that art is decorative and it's there to be repeated. And an artist's role in society is that of a factory market person. It's just there as a product that we sell. So therefore reflecting as cultural workers on memory became really important to me to understand how different sectors of society need to interpolate and interact and engage and understand their own validity. So how to do that? We decided to invite a number of practitioners from across Globalizing Souths to speak about how they had engaged different interdisciplinary practices. And it was through workshops, through residencies, co-generated texts. It wasn't easy. There were a lot of problems. We struggled with content being too theoretical for an audience that really struggled with the baseline of theory, because the education system in Vietnam is so thin. They don't have much reform since the 1920s, and history is not taught in the art historical courses, in art history studio practices. So there was a conundrum as to which register do we enter. You know, do we start up here? Do we start more generally? And I made a strategic decision to start up high, because there's another part of my community that only focus on the translation of Hegel and Heidegger. And I was quite markedly concerned with how this thinking was constantly being written in texts, but with a vast misunderstanding of how these authors have been reread in the 20th century since these early translations were done. Thinking about the role of social science was also understanding that a lot of my community are starting to understand through looking at the West and how artists are social engaged people, and they're doing more work with communities. But their understandings of the ethical parameters of engaging community is not taught. So what are the kinds of relationships we need to consider when we're working with communities that are not our own, or the communities that are always assuming someone else can and should speak for them? So how do we expand awareness of that sensitivity? And then the final one was mythology, which for me is a very powerful way of returning narratives of value beyond the colonial rubric, which was to understand that culture has its own mechanisms to which we can find our own contemporaneity. And it's quite astonishing to me how in Vietnam, and indeed much of Southeast Asia's youth, they really don't have an understanding of the detail behind the mythologies that are present on the street. So it was a real pleasure to put this project together, but if I was to do it again, there are many things that I would do differently.
In the last segment from what I read, of this initiative was Embedded Souths, which was a kind of a digital exhibition, which is also something quite, I mean, it's sort of, I was a bit surprised initially to imagine that choice, where it came from, because this seems sort of deeply kind of in a group dynamic, bringing people in face to face, and then it sort of had that element as well. So
I wish I could show you, but that site has also been shut down on me. So I lose a lot of my work due to not only political stuff, but also web. Just anyway, another story. Embedded South was a film program put together 2016 where SANART worked with 18 different like-minded, artist-driven, community-driven institutions across Africa, Latin America, South and Southeast Asia. And I co-curated with Gabriela Salgado and a Hanoian curator, Le Tuan Nguyen. And the three of us put together a set of films that followed the three subjects of conscious realities. And it was a very marked decision for us to build this film platform where three different time zones could log in for specific programs in a certain site. We collaborated with 5 different orgs so that they could have their communities go to that org to watch and engage collectively, and then we were chiming in through live webcam. It was a really wonderful project. I've been asked to do edition 2, actually. The decisions to do it was based on the fact that in Vietnam, film is the most highly censored medium in the country. It is incredibly difficult to find access to non-commercial film. We wanted to go rogue with it in Vietnam, but we were understanding that we couldn't show it at SANART because we would definitely get shut down. So in Vietnam, there was no ability to have a physical hub, but we were online for an entire 48 hours, just plugging into all of these different networks. And it was really amazing for my community to see on screen, "Hello Vietnam" from Kampala, or "Hello Vietnam" from Joburg, you know, and it was one of those moments where they get to sense an international in their hood that's coming out of their own community that's driven it. And that empowerment has taught me a lot, that you can do all this work to assuming your audiences, but what about what it means for your local to give back in that other way? So Embedded South very much taught me that. It's also been interesting, this platform of Embedded South gave access to a lot of very young filmmakers across the region, and we noticed that we had major educational institutions in the US and Europe chiming in and using it as class material. And one of the reasons that I'm in trouble right now is the site is shut down, and I've got many educators asking me, can you please put it back up? Because there was all of this material, bios, inflections, responses, much was what China must get all the time.
Connecting, this is my last question, then we can open it up. But just, it seems that when you're looking at cosmologies and again sort of ritual practice and indigenous vocabularies in a sense with the next phase, would you consider also the sort of rural kind of audience or participation and other partners perhaps for that? I think you mentioned it in your concept, but just to elaborate.
Yeah, I can show you the final. So basically for the project we are with initial seed funding from the Prince Claus Fund. I'm just last week gained confirmation from Fulbright University, Vietnam, and also hoping to get, we also have the Oxford Clinical Research Unit. The Oxford Clinical Research Unit is a fabulous scientific body in Ho Chi Minh City that is connected to the Wellcome Trust in the UK. For those of you who don't know the Wellcome Trust, they do some incredible work linking the visual arts to the sciences, using culture as a means of pushing scientific dialogue. It's maybe 4 years or 5 years that I've done programming with them. But for this particular fellowship, definitely what we want to do is to take this discourse to the communities that are undergoing the pollution and indeed suffering the most from, oh, I do this again, so sorry, Viti. For realizing this, one of the anxiety, can you go to the last slide? Sorry. The anxiety around the project surrounds the fact that just last week there was a dance company that was showcasing certain narratives similar to what this young artist, Tuan Mummy, He comes from a province in the north, Hanam, and it's the same province that this particular pagoda, it's the largest Buddhist complex in the world, and it's been eating this virgin forest, and these are the conditions on the ground. This is actually a 6-channel installation. But the dance company last week was taking images of this particular condition in northern Vietnam as part of their backdrops for their dance performances, and they were immediately shut down. So one of my nervousness with the programming is how to create strategic partners so that we actually have not this immediate shutdown, but at least a small window to which we can engage. For the launch of Conscious Realities, I had a similar concern, so we decided to partner with the National University of Vietnam and ask a very prominent chemist who was a Nobel laureate to come in and launch, so that the government, they can't shut down their Nobel laureate. So I think I'm going to have to do something similar for the launch of Realigning the Cosmos, was just to get some kind of celebrity in to do the introduction, to give validity to the study, so that we've got some window of time before it, I think it eventually we will get, I don't know if I answered your question.
Covering indigenous narratives, but this process of retelling is also open to a lot of manipulations from those who are in power, and they would like to manipulate these retellings to their benefit. So this is a very, very fraught project. And how, I don't know, I mean, how do we safeguard this process? I mean, we have to recover from the imperial impositions, distortions, but how do we ensure that it's not going to be manipulated by people who have a sort of a, you know.
I think my own experience has been, don't rush to make anything visible. Much of my own work over the last 15 years has recognized that you need to give time to narrative, you need to sit with it. And often the processes of making something visible don't become apparent until much, much later. So the impetus to make something visible, I question all the time. As I shared with the biennial, like some of that material could never be seen at home. And it's partly because of that there was never any impetus to make it any other way. So how to nurture those narratives, for me, my answer would be, don't ignore them, get them done, get them recorded, because they're disappearing. But make sure that you really carefully strategize how you make it visible and to what end.
Super inspiring and amazing story to tell as well. I was kind of interested on your views about, you know, you touched on in different ways about just being there and, you know, yourself, placing yourself in this context. Also, you know, Vietnamese artists maybe leaving, but maybe returning, and I know this has happened in Vietnam and they've actually made huge change, but also aspiring curators being there and other international visitors visiting. So I was interested in kind of your views of, you know, just being there, just turning up, and I think there's incredible value with that, and I think related to some of the things that Nayantara was saying yesterday, whether projects are visible, whether there's a fancy museum, whether there's the infrastructure, I think there's great value for people just being there. So I guess my question is, you know, if you could reflect on that about people just turning up, just showing that they're interested, that they want to see more, they want to discuss more, but also do you ever get worried that there might be a time when people stop turning up because of their own fears, or because they lose interest because it becomes so hard?
Well, indeed, in many ways, I'm already facing that, because we opened a show at the factory last week. We were censored before we were opened, and then 3 days later, censored even more. So this is happening at a more alarming rate, and artists are starting to perceive the factory as a space where they can't do what they want. So I'm already currently kind of battling this now, in terms of your second question about, you know, you get scared about them not turning up. In terms of what does it mean to show up, I am very grateful for the number of curators and collectors and artists that have started circulating in my region. It's been quite amazing since ASEAN relaxed the visas. We've seen a lot more exchange. We still don't really have enough curatorial knowledge exchanging in our region, though. I find that we're still parachuting into the same voices, to the same studios, and how to combat that practice when it comes to building these museum glass box scenarios. I mean, the Asia Pacific Triennial really taught me so much in terms of what research can be afforded by nurturing network. And I think that that is the key thing that I rely on, and I indeed pass this on to all of the curators that work with me, is that you must build your own network and do not assume to mirror another. You have to have your own. And that is how you gain your own validity with the narratives that you map out. Returning to Donna Haraway's quote, it matters what knowledge is, no knowledge is. There's a sense that we're never going to be on that currency forever. I'm always aware that, like right now, Vietnam's at this sort of peak, and everybody wants Vietnam. And I get a little kind of distraught because I'm like, I don't have enough content, don't take it away, I need it here. Because our artists are suffering education systems that are so poor, they largely go abroad and they don't come home. So there's a sense where I always do know that things will drop off. And so that's why I focus on my local. That's why I focus on what are we doing for ourselves. It's why I choose to remain in Vietnam and build this institution in Vietnam, despite all of the obstacles that I'm facing, because I know that that level of currency is so, it's going to pass very quickly.
Going to be the last question, and then we can take more during the group discussion.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. So my question is a little personal though. So you mentioned that, you know, you're a child of mixed heritage. So do you feel like that is something that is, I wouldn't say an advantage, but kind of helps you or characterizes or directs your practice, even in, you know, approaching artists? You can maybe connect with them on a level that has these dual histories that you're carrying within yourself. So do you feel like that's something specific that gives your practice an edge?
Yeah, I think it does. Actually, it was just this morning I was having a conversation with what gives you, Zoe, the right to speak for Vietnam. You are not Vietnamese. And my answer to them was, I am Hong Kong British, Australian. Haven't lived there for 15 years, moved around a lot, spent the last you heard me in my intro. And they look at me and I said, so can I speak as an Australian? Can I speak as a Vietnamese? Can I speak as someone from Hong Kong? Where am I valid? And then when I talk to artists, you know, when we were doing the work with Tuan Andrew and he's going to Senegal, very much the constant conversations between the both of us was, what right does he have to picture the memories of the Senegalese? And so in conversation, we looked at the data that we had in front of us and we said we need to give the voice back to the descendants. So let's turn their stories, visualized by Tuan, into this narrative. And so the perspective, well, the placement of perspective is always a conversation. I will say, though, that I will never, ever get asked to do anything about Vietnam globally. I don't get asked. There are Vietnamese curators, they get asked, but I do not. And I'm totally fine with that.
We'll close on that note. Thank you so much, Zoe.